David Leslie, the First Lord of Newark, the Leonidas of the Lowlands, started his military service in 1630, choosing as many Scots had done to join the Swedish army of Gustavus Adolphus or Gustav Adolf of the Swedish Empire, fighting against their various foes like the Catholic Holy Roman Empire and the Polish during the 30 Years' War. In 1632 he switched allegiances to the Russians, who were also fighting the Polish during the Smolensk War, and 2 years later, after the successful conclusion of that campaign, he rejoined Swedish service, becoming a cavalry commander, which was an incredibly important promotion as his counterattack at the Battle of Wittstock, which outflanked the imperial positions, led to a great Swedish victory after the defeat at Nördlingen some years before. However, in 1640 he sailed back across the North Sea to Scotland, for his country was in need of him. Now at the time in 1640, of course, there was originally a Scottish king on the throne of both Scotland and England, and this was Charles I. He was the son of James I of England, who was also the King of Scotland. However, the two still had their separate parliaments, and Scotland and England were rather different in character, and part of this was in the religion. Now in England, the system of religion ever since the Tudors had been Episcopalian. Essentially this meant that it was the monarch who chose the bishops and the clergy of the church, and that's the way it went, and the congregation, the members of the church, had nothing to say about it. That was the way it went. However, most Scots were not part of the Episcopalian system. Most Scots were rather Reformed Protestants of a Presbyterian belief, which was that the congregation chose the ministers. This did not involve bishops at all. However, Charles I wanted to ensure that the Episcopalian system used in England was uniform across his kingdoms, and so tried to enforce it on the Scots. However, the Scots were very much against this, and several of the leading nobles, including the Marquis of Montrose, who I have a separate video about that will be linked at various points, signed the National Covenant, which was a document essentially saying that the Scots did not want to have this Episcopalian system and wanted the Presbyterian system that meant that the king didn't meddle in church affairs. However, Charles wanted to impose the Episcopalian system by force, and so he started to assemble an army in late 1639. However, the Scots did the same, and they, being the signatories of the National Covenant, became known as the Covenanters, and they would meet in battle in 1640 at the Battle of Newburn in the Tyne Valley, the Scots Covenanters winning a crushing victory over their Royalist enemies. They couldn't know, though, that this would be just the start of over a decade of bloody conflict that would see hundreds of thousands die throughout the three kingdoms of England, Scotland and Ireland, because this was just the end of the Second Bishops' War. Of course, in England this would become the English Civil War. The Long Parliament being held was actually the one to get the funds for another invasion of Scotland to punish them for their victories. This also translated across the border into Scotland, with the Scottish Parliament and various factions within Scotland being loyal to King Charles, wanting to send troops to support him. The two factions within Scotland being at loggerheads with each other, especially after the Scottish, largely Covenanter-dominated Parliament signed the League of the Solemn and Covenant with the English parliamentarians, essentially joining the English Civil War on the side of the English Parliament, although of course there were also Royalists in Scotland. Now at this time the Royalists were doing fairly well in the north of England, which was largely supporting King Charles and the Royalists, and so it was decided that this Covenanter army marched into England after the Royalists had won various battles in the north around York and started to attack the parliamentarian garrisons around Hull in the south of Yorkshire. Now at this time also there were several armies of the parliamentarians which converged on a large army of the Marquis of Newcastle. One from Manchester led by the Earl of Manchester and another by Sir Thomas Fairfax, who had earlier been defeated by Newcastle's Royalist army, as well as of course the Covenanters led by David Leslie marching south from the Lowlands. Now they met at a place called Marston Moor. This was after the relief of York, which was a Royalist garrison that had been besieged by Fairfax and the Covenanters. Now on this battle they started largely with a cavalry charge led by the soon to be famous Oliver Cromwell, who at that time was in command of the Earl of Manchester's horse. Now he charged in and actually was wounded in the neck by a musket ball, and so left the field. At this stage, of course, David Leslie comes into the limelight, and he charged through into the battle and helped out Cromwell's cavalry that was left leaderless and swung the advantage in their favour against the troops of the Royalists. Now for the rest of the battle there were large pushes in the centre and the flank, by the infantry of both sides without really a clear winner. Sometimes the parliamentarians pushed on and forced the royalists to flee, and then there was a countercharge from another royalist regiment, and it would go the other way. However, it was when Cromwell came back onto the field and he and David Leslie led a cavalry charge through the royalist lines that the battle really swung in their favour, and soon most of the royalists were retreating into the darkness back to York after having been defeated. The last regiment which refused quarter was the Marquis of Newcastle's own, a Northumbrian regiment called the Whitecoats or the White Lambs or Newcastle's Lambs, who refused quarter. And it's thought that from a number of around 3,000 at the start of the battle, only at the end, after resisting charge after charge of infantry and cavalry on the Parliament side, did 30 of them surrender at the end, the rest of them all being killed in the final stand that they made at the Battle of Marston Moor. Now, of course, David Leslie played a very important role in the Battle of Marston Moor, his cavalry charges being at exactly the right moment to swing the essential stages both at the start and towards the end of the battle in Parliament's favour. Marston Moor being a very important victory because it smashed the northern hold on the north, and it really brought down to bear Parliament's power there in areas like Manchester, and they would of course later on go on to dominate that area. The last place that the Royalists held would be the southwest, because the north had been weakened by the Battle of Marston Moor and would thereafter be weakened by other parliamentarian victories. However, at this time, he went down onto the west into Cumbria because he was there to besiege the castle of Carlisle, which was also a royalist garrison. But soon afterwards, he went back north, back to his home country, because the royalists were doing quite well in Scotland at that time, seeing as though the most experienced Covenanter commander was down in England. Now, this was, of course, the Marquis of Montrose, and I actually have a video about him which you can watch, and his men, after they had won several victories against superior Covenanter forces, superior in number and sometimes in training, and so they recalled David Leslie to go back and fight them. He was of course supported by Alasdair MacCulloch, by this Irish, Scottish, Gaelic hero, and many of the MacDonalds who supported him. However, when David Leslie marched north, he caught the Marquis of Montrose unaware. He'd been abandoned by many of his Highlanders who had gone back home because they'd won loot and they thought they were safe up in the Highlands and didn't want to leave the Campbells, who were their traditional enemies, and march into England to support Charles after his defeat at Naseby. So Leslie came into the north and was able to defeat the Marquis of Montrose at the Battle of Philiphaugh, although he was able to escape to fight another day against his forces. Now, after the battle, however, Leslie's troops committed one of the many atrocities of the War of the Three Kingdoms, in which around 100 of the MacDonalds under Alasdair MacCulloch surrendered to the parliamentarian forces, and they, with around 300 of their camp followers, many of them women and children, were slaughtered by his forces. Now, following this battle, he once again did battle with the troops of Alasdair MacCulloch and defeated them again. And following this defeat, he fled back into Ireland, essentially ending the Royalist standards' hold on Scotland, leaving some 300 of his men at the castle at Dunaverty, which Leslie then besieged and was able to capture, although once again some 300 MacDonalds were killed in cold blood by his men at what became known as the Dunaverty Massacre. It's at this point when it seems that David Leslie has saved both the parliamentarian cause in England and in Scotland that things take a bit of a strange turn, as the Covenanters, who had so resolutely been fighting against the Royalists since 1639, split into two various factions. The one faction are become known as the Engagers, and this faction decided that when Charles I had been captured and was being held in the north of England under imprisonment, that they decided they'd become so illusioned with the parliamentarians, who were becoming dominated by Oliver Cromwell and really quite radical Puritans who weren't necessarily as Presbyterian as they were, and they signed what became known as the Engagement with Charles I, which was essentially that they would free him from captivity if he could help them out with the Covenant and ensuring that the Presbyterian system would remain in place, which is of course what they're named after for signing this document, the Covenant. They are the Covenanters. However, another part or faction of the Covenanters became known as the Kirk Party. Kirk is the Scots word for church, and they believed that there was no reason to believe that Charles I would actually uphold the Covenant should they be victorious, and they decided not to support Charles I or sign the Engagement, and so they were at loggerheads with the Engagers, who did. Now, the Engagers obviously then signed this engagement with Charles I and led an army into England in 1648. And with this army, however, David Leslie was offered the command, but he refused to command it, as was his old commander from Sweden, Alexander Leslie, no relation. He was the first Earl of Leven. They both refused to command it, and so it was commanded by a much more inferior commander, by a man named Hamilton. And this actually was a disastrous campaign because the English had just reformed their army, and part of this army reformation was the foundation of what became known as the New Model Army, which is really quite famous for how effective it was, but also how religiously zealous it was. One of the reasons that Oliver Cromwell was able to assert command and would eventually become the real dictator over England, Scotland and Ireland. And at the Battle of Preston, this army absolutely decimated the Engager Covenanters and the remaining Royalists, who pushed south into England in the Second English Civil War. Now, after this, it becomes rather stranger because in 1650, the Kirk Party, so the other half of the Covenanters, after they had retaken power with the Earl of Argyll, who was the old enemy of the Marquis of Montrose, after they led their Whiggish revolt on Edinburgh, recapturing Edinburgh, they then signed an agreement with the son of Charles I. Now, Charles I was executed by Parliament, but his son, Charles II, then signed an agreement with the Scottish Covenanters because the rest of the Covenanters had decided that they too thought that the English Puritans were becoming too extreme for them, that they didn't think their rights would be upheld by them with their system of the church, which is essentially why they rose in the first place, so that they could keep their independence over the church and run it as they wanted it. So now they joined sides with the Royalists. However, of course, this annoyed the parliamentarians, and the New Model Army under Cromwell marched into Scotland in 1650. Now, David Leslie, first of all, was very clever in denying to do battle with them and actually outmaneuvered the New Model Army and trapped them south of Dunbar, which is an important border town in Scotland. However, as was often the case with the Covenanters, the ministers were incredibly important, and so the high-up members of the Scots Church persuaded Leslie or forced him into battle even when the situation was unfavourable. So he started to remaneuver his army. However, at this point they were set upon by Cromwell, who led a surprise attack against them at the Battle of Dunbar, which was a massive rout of the Scots and a crushing defeat at the hands of Oliver Cromwell and the New Model Army. Many more actually died after the Battle of Dunbar. Recently in Durham Cathedral they found the skeletons of some of the Scots who were kept there in Durham Cathedral, and these really brutal conditions ensured that many of the Scots died, as well as many being sent off to the colonies, places like the Americas and Australia and the East Indies, where many of them will have died from disease into indentured servitude. And actually there are some reconstructions that have been done at Durham Cathedral where they found some of the faces of these Scots. So if you're interested in seeing what they actually would have looked like, some of these Covenanters, then I'll leave a link down below so you can find out what they look like. But I thought that's an interesting tidbit of knowledge down there. But with David Leslie, then he and Charles also decided to keep up going with the fight. Now, they had lost a huge amount of men at the Battle of Dunbar, but all wasn't lost yet, and they really had a difference in opinion about how they should continue the campaign. Now, David Leslie knew that the Royalist cause was strong in Scotland. Now, remember that they had been divided between the Covenanters, who were against the king, and the Royalists, especially in the Highlands, with men following the Marquis of Montrose. But now all of them essentially were on the same sides, the Covenanters distrusting the English Parliament, and the Royalists, of course, wanting to reinstate the Stuart, so Charles II onto the throne. However, Charles wanted to lead an invasion into England, especially because he thought he could outpace the New Model Army after Dunbar and reach London first, thus securing the capital and having a great hand over the enemy, because the capital had a large garrison in it and lots of munitions and weapons. However, this really failed, as even though the Scottish Covenanter army and the Royalists joined together, at the siege or Battle of Worcester, the English New Model Army was once again incredibly effective at destroying the Allied troops arrayed against them, thus ending the final English Civil War in 1650. After this, David Leslie was captured and taken to the Tower of London in 1651. However, he'd only have 9 years to wait, at which point Oliver Cromwell was dead and Charles II was brought back and restored to the English throne in the English Restoration in 1660, at which point he was made the Lord of Newark, which is one of the towns that he coincidentally also besieged during the War of the Three Kingdoms, or the English Civil War. Now, David Leslie died in 1682, and I think he should be remembered as one of the great generals and heroes of Scottish history and the Covenanters, and he is by many people. So this has been my video on David Leslie, who I coined the Leonidas of the Lowlands. Now, please do let me know what you think of this video, if you enjoyed it, and if you haven't seen it, then I would recommend, if you found this one interesting at least, to go over and have a look about my video on the Marquis of Montrose, James Graham, who was a similar figure to David Leslie in some aspects, but was an ardent royalist for the entirety of the civil wars, leading many of the clans in the Highlands against parliamentarian forces, especially the Scottish Covenanter forces that David Leslie led. So if you did enjoy it, give me a thumbs up, let me know what you thought in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you're new, and tap that bell to make sure that you're always updated when I next upload. So thank you very much for watching. I have been History with Hilbert, and I hope you all have a great day.